A narcissist does not live in truth. They live in a story. And that story does not exist to reflect reality, but to keep their ego structure from collapsing. For them, truth only has value when it serves the image. When truth begins to endanger that image, it is immediately distorted, eliminated, or replaced with a more comfortable version. This is not deliberate wrongdoing in the ordinary moral sense, but a reflex of psychological survival. In the early stage of the relationship, the empath is often assigned a very specific role within that story. The one who understands, the one who empathizes, the one who is the only person who truly understands me, the one who can soothe, soften, and illuminate an inner world that is fundamentally empty and unstable. The empath is not loved for who they truly are, but for the emotional regulation function they provide. You become the anchor, the mirror, the filter, the container for parts the narcissist cannot or does not dare to contain within themselves. The problem does not arise when you give. The problem arises when you stop giving in the same way. The moment the empath begins to set boundaries, even very gently, very silently, is the moment the story begins to crack. You do not need to confront them. You do not need to protest or argue. Simply by no longer reacting as before, no longer absorbing emotions on their behalf, no longer automatically soothing them whenever they destabilize, the narcissist's internal system begins to lose balance. Because they do not possess the capacity for self-regulation, they borrow that capacity from you. When that regulating source is withdrawn, a void appears. And that void is not experienced as sadness or longing in the way an ordinary person might feel it. It is experienced as an existential threat, a form of ego disorientation, a sense of no longer knowing who they are without your reflection. This is why a narcissist cannot tolerate the calm withdrawal of an empath. To them, it is not a boundary. It is a disruption of their internal order. Yet the narcissist has no capacity to look inward and say, I am collapsing because I am dependent. Nor can they admit, I need you in order to exist. Such realizations are too painful, too dangerous to the ego. So the mind is forced to find another escape route. And that escape is called rewriting the story. In the new story, the source of instability does not lie within them, it lies in you. You become the one who has changed, the one who is, not who they used to be, the one who is cold, selfish, ungrateful, cruel, not because you have done something wrong, but because you no longer perform the role required to keep the old story alive. When the old story can no longer stand, the narcissist does not change themselves, they change the character. This is where many empaths are wounded most deeply. Not because they are rejected, but because their essence is distorted. You watch yourself being turned into a foreign, warped image that bears no resemblance to who you were, how you lived, how you gave, how you sacrificed. And the most painful part is this. You know that if you try to explain, if you try to prove yourself, if you try to clarify, you will only be pulled deeper into their story. Because the moment you participate in correcting the story, you have already accepted their rules of the game. If we look more deeply through the lens of depth psychology, this is not a moral failing at the personal level, but the operation of persona and shadow. The persona is the image the narcissist must maintain in order to exist in the world and before themselves. That image must always be right, always reasonable, always the victim, always worthy of being understood. When the empath withdraws, the persona loses its mirror. And when the persona is no longer reinforced, the shadow, those disowned parts such as dependency, envy, shame, and inner emptiness begins to surface. But the shadow never recognizes itself as the shadow. It always requires an external object onto which it can be projected. The empath, the one who stood closest to the truth, becomes the ideal container for that projection. Everything the narcissist cannot tolerate within themselves is poured onto you. You become the problem, so they do not have to face the real problem. Therefore, When the empath is turned into the villain, it is not a sign that you have gone astray. On the contrary, it is evidence that you have left the position of being used. You are no longer part of their emotional regulation system. You are no longer the mirror, no longer the container. And when a system loses a critical component, it will attempt to eliminate or smear that component in order to explain the malfunction. What empaths must understand if they do not want to be pulled back into a spiral of guilt is this: you are not punished because you are bad. You are punished because you are no longer useful to the old structure. The narcissist does not hate you because you hurt them. They fear you because you showed them a truth they cannot contain, that they are not whole, not independent, not as solid as they believe themselves to be. And when that truth cannot be digested, it must be expelled in the form of a villain. This is why so many empaths, upon entering the stage of awakening, go through the same experience: collective misunderstanding, smearing, labeling, and isolation from the old story. Not because they have become worse, but because they have stopped playing the savior. And in the narcissist's world, there is no place for characters who refuse the role. This video is not meant to ignite outrage. It is meant to bring clarity, because only when empaths understand that being cast as the villain is a structured psychological consequence do they stop trying to fix themselves in order to be right in someone else's story. And from that moment, the journey of truly leaving the role can finally begin. After the story is rewritten, something crucial happens inside the narcissist, though they are never able to name it. It is not simply anger, nor is it exactly hatred. What truly emerges is shame, primitive shame, deeper than any surface emotion and the most dangerous force to their ego structure. A narcissist's shame is not like ordinary shame when a person recognizes they are wrong. Their shame does not lead to reflection. It leads to disintegration. Because beneath the confident, strong, righteous persona lies an ego that was never securely formed. They do not possess a stable self that can say, "I was wrong, but I still exist." For a narcissist, admitting fault is equivalent to losing the right to exist psychologically. And it is precisely the empath, through silent withdrawal, who inadvertently touches that most fragile point. When you no longer mirror, no longer soothe, no longer absorb emotions on their behalf, the narcissist is forced to confront what they have always avoided: the inner void. That void has no concrete form. It is the feeling of having no center, no intrinsic value, no identity without external confirmation. This is why a narcissist cannot tolerate the energetic absence of an empath, even if you are still physically or socially present. But instead of recognizing that feeling as shame, they transform it into something easier to manage: blame. Here, projection is no longer an abstract concept from textbooks. It becomes a survival mechanism. The narcissist does not say, "I am ashamed because I am dependent." They say, "You have changed." They do not feel, "I am empty." They feel, "You are cold." They do not face the truth that they cannot self-regulate emotionally. They become convinced that "you hurt me," and thus shame is externalized. Viewed through the lens of depth psychology, we can clearly see the shadow operating at a deep level. The shadow does not only contain bad traits, it contains everything the ego cannot accept about itself. For the narcissist, the shadow holds dependency, weakness, feelings of worthlessness, and the terror of not existing without reflection. These contents are too threatening to be integrated. Therefore, they must be expelled. The empath who once stood very close becomes the ideal container for that shadow. One crucial point must be emphasized. The narcissist does not choose the empath as the villain because you are weak. They choose you because you were once safe enough for projection. You were patient enough to contain, understanding enough not to resist, But when you stop containing, the shadow does not disappear. It simply changes direction. And that direction points straight at you. From here, a painful paradox emerges. The empath is punished not for causing harm, but for no longer being willing to absorb harm on someone else's behalf. Shame, when it is not integrated, seeks to destroy the witness. A narcissist cannot tolerate the existence of someone who remains outside the control of their story while still retaining calmness. Your calmness is a silent indictment. It does not say that they are wrong, but it makes them feel wrong. And for a narcissist, feeling wrong is far worse than being openly criticized. This is why, at this stage, you often witness a clear shift in how they speak about you to others. The narrative begins to expand. It is no longer a private conflict. It becomes a collective story. You are portrayed as the source of all disorder. Every negative emotion they experience is given a single cause: you. Not because they want to destroy you, but because they need an explanatory framework in order to survive. And that framework can only stand if you are the villain. What empaths often do wrong at this stage, usually unconsciously, is trying to prove the truth, trying to explain that they never intended harm, trying to clarify that they simply needed boundaries. But all of these efforts are futile, because you are speaking the language of truth, while the narcissist operates in the language of psychological function. For them, the story does not need to be true, it only needs to preserve the ego. Shame that is not acknowledged turns into hostility. Not personal hostility, but hostility toward anyone who exposes vulnerability. And the empath, through their very awakening, has done exactly that. You did not attack. You did not accuse, but you no longer shielded them. And that absence of shielding leaves everything inside them more exposed than ever before. Here, a difficult truth must be stated plainly. The narcissist is not truly angry because they lost you. They are angry because they lost your role in their self-regulation system. And when that role disappears, they must either mature or find another way not to collapse. Most choose the latter, restructuring the story, finding a new source of reflection, and keeping you fixed in the role of villain within the collective memory. For the empath, this is the stage where self-doubt most easily arises. You begin to ask yourself, am I really too cold? Did I hurt them? Should I be a little softer? And this is where the greatest test appears, not a moral test, but a test of inner sovereignty. If you return to fix the story, you return to the old role. If you try to be understood, you re-enter the system. If you sacrifice your boundaries to avoid being seen as the villain, you once again place yourself in the position of absorbing the shadow, and the cycle continues. This is not meant to push the empath into confrontation. It is meant to offer a key realization. Being turned into the villain is the direct consequence of no longer colluding with another person's avoidance of shame. You did not cause the shame, you simply stopped hiding it. And when this is clearly understood, a crucial shift occurs. The empath stops trying to be right in the narcissist's story. You begin to ask a different question. Do I still need to be in this story at all? That question opens the door to the next stage, a stage in which power no longer lies in the narrative, but in conscious withdrawal. There is a common misconception that leads many empaths to blame themselves. They believe the narcissist's pain comes from losing love. In reality, what is taken away when the empath withdraws energy is not love, but the function of ego regulation. And it is this loss of function that triggers narcissistic injury, a form of injury that does not appear as sadness, but as a collapse of inner orientation. When the empath stops reacting, stops explaining, stops absorbing, something critical happens. The feedback loop is severed. Previously, every emotional state of the narcissist, anxiety, envy, anger, emptiness, was processed through you. You were the place where they discharged, where they were affirmed, where they were seen without having to look at themselves. When you withdraw from that role, they do not just lose you, they lose their familiar operating mechanism. Narcissistic injury does not explode immediately. It does not appear as an outburst. Its initial phase is often stagnation. The narcissist becomes unusually quiet, more observant, more watchful. They do not know how to respond when you no longer signal. Your silence provides no data. Without data, they cannot adjust the persona. And when the persona cannot be adjusted, they fall into uncertainty. This is where empaths often misunderstand. You see their silence and think maybe they have let go. But in reality, they are disoriented. The narcissist does not know how to approach you when the old buttons no longer work. The strategies that once succeeded, inducing guilt, playing the victim, creating emotional tension, now slide into empty space. You do not resist, but you do not absorb. You are not cold in an aggressive sense. You simply no longer participate. According to Carl Jung's Jungian analysis, when psychic energy is no longer invested outward in its habitual way, the ego enters a state of instability. For someone with a fragile self-structure, this withdrawal of libido is experienced as an existential threat. The narcissist does not merely lose attention, they lose an anchor of identity. This is why, after a period of probing silence, you often witness indirect reactions, not direct dialogue, but peripheral movements. They may talk about you more to others, tighten control over the narrative, or display an excessively stable image on the surface. This is not a sign of recovery. It is an attempt to patch the persona while it is cracking inside. What is striking is this: the less response they receive from you, the more activated the narcissist becomes. Not because you are important in the sense of healthy attachment, but because you were once the central point of reflection. When that mirror disappears, they cannot see themselves. And not seeing oneself is an intolerable state for an ego structure dependent on external reflection. Empaths often do not realize the extent of the impact of their silence because they are doing nothing. But that very doing nothing is the most powerful act. You do not fight back, so they have no clear enemy. You do not return, so they have no victory. You do not collapse, so they have no proof that their story is right. Your calm becomes a void that cannot be interpreted. At this stage, narcissistic injury often splits into two parallel directions. On one hand, they attempt to restore power by reinforcing the narrative. You are wrong, cruel, ungrateful. On the other hand, they quietly monitor, observe, and search for any sign that you are still affected. Because the moment you react, even with anger or sadness, they have data again. And data means control. This is why empaths must clearly understand the nature of this stage. Your silence is not avoidance, it is sovereign withdrawal of energy. You are not closing the door to punish. You are closing the door to stop being drained. And when that one-way flow ceases, the narcissist is forced to face a choice they have always avoided. Either integrate or find another structure to lean on. Most choose the second option. They seek a new mirror, a new stage, a new story. But this does not erase the narcissistic injury. It only postpones it. Because the real wound is not the loss of you, but the exposure of dependency. And once that dependency has been touched, it is not easily forgotten. For the empath, this stage is often accompanied by a strange feeling, both relief and emptiness. You are no longer pulled into chaos, but you also no longer have a familiar role. This is the moment when your identity must be restructured. No longer the savior, no longer the keeper of someone else's emotional rhythm, you begin to learn how to let energy return to yourself. If this is not understood, empaths easily return out of guilt. You see their instability, and the old part of you wants to soothe. But returning at this point is not love, it is restoring the old system. And that system will continue to drain you until there is nothing left to take. This marks a crucial boundary in the entire journey, from being turned into the villain to no longer participating in the story at all. Narcissistic injury is not something you caused. It is the consequence of no longer functioning as the regulator for a structure that cannot stand on its own. And when this is seen clearly, the empath stops asking, "Am I cruel?" You begin to ask the more accurate question, "Am I living in alignment with my own sovereignty?" From that question, the next stage opens a stage in which the narcissist is no longer the center of the analysis. The focus begins to shift toward you. The restructuring of the empath's ego after withdrawing energy. And that is where real power resides. Leaving the villain role is not a dramatic decision. It does not occur in a heroic moment, nor does it require an announcement of withdrawal. In truth, it is a quiet process of ego restructuring, in which the empath gradually realizes that they no longer belong to the story that once sustained them and also once exhausted them. When true awakening begins, the first thing is not strength, but disorientation. You leave the role, but you do not yet have a new one. And it is precisely in that void that the old ego dissolves to make space for a different structure. In the early stage, many empaths still carry a need to be understood correctly. Even after becoming silent, even after withdrawing their energy, there remains a thin inner thread. What if they understood the truth? This is the residue of the savior role, the role that once defined your value through being seen as good, right, self-sacrificing. But awakening does not happen when you are vindicated. Awakening happens when you no longer need vindication. The empath's new ego is not built through resistance, but through the release of attachment. You begin to understand that being labeled the villain is not a mistake to be corrected, but a sign that you have withdrawn from a dependent system. When you stop trying to fix the story loses its power. Not because you win, but because you are no longer there for it to operate. Here, a subtle yet decisive shift occurs. You stop centering how you are perceived and begin centering how you are living. This may sound obvious, but for an empath, someone conditioned early on to read others' emotions and adjust themselves accordingly, it represents a profound structural reversal. You no longer measure your worth through external feedback. You begin to measure it through inner steadiness. Ego restructuring is not about becoming strong in a superficial sense. It is the process of dismantling false identifications. You realize you are not responsible for managing other people's emotions. Not the one who maintains harmony by self-harm. Not the mirror that allows others to see their idealized selves. When these roles fall away, you are not left empty, you feel lighter. Through the lens of Carl Jung, this is the movement from unconscious identification into the process of individuation. Individuation is not about becoming different from others, but about no longer being governed by unconscious roles. The empath was once caught in participation mystique, the blurring of boundaries between self and other. Awakening occurs when you reclaim those boundaries, not to isolate, but to return to your own center. At this stage, guilt often arises as a final test. Not guilt because you have done something wrong, but because you are no longer doing what was expected of you. You no longer carry. You no longer explain. You no longer prove. And the old, conditioned part of you, trained to please, will whisper that you are becoming selfish. This is where a clear distinction is essential. Selfishness is placing yourself above others by violating them. Boundaries are stopping others from violating you. These are not the same. Leaving the villain role also means accepting a difficult truth. There are people who will never change the way they tell your story. Not because they lack information, but because they need that story to sustain their ego structure. When you accept this, a great burden falls away. You stop waiting for validation from a place that cannot provide it. and the energy once trapped in waiting begins to return. As energy returns, a new order forms. You begin to hear your body's signals more clearly. You notice that you are no longer tense when you do not respond, no longer losing sleep trying to figure out what to say correctly, no longer obsessed with being misunderstood. This calm is not emotional numbness. It is the result of an ego no longer being pulled outward to function for someone else. At this stage, the narcissist, if they are still observing, will notice something unsettling. You no longer react in predictable ways. You are no longer defensive, but you are not open either. No longer angry, but not returning. To them, you become hard to read. And this unreadability is the clearest sign that you have exited the role. The villain role only exists when there is an audience and a script. When you leave the stage, the role dissolves on its own. Ego restructuring also brings changes to other relationships. The empath begins to recognize familiar dynamics, where they once overgave, where they were praised for sacrificing, not to blame, but to recalibrate. You learn to give without erasing yourself, to say no without lengthy explanations, to be present without dissolving. One of the clearest signs of the new ego is this. You no longer need to end the story with a moral lesson. You do not need to prove who was right or wrong. You do not need to close things with a victory. You simply close the door and continue living. To outsiders, this may look like indifference. Internally, it is deep focus on your own life. Leaving the villain role does not make you invisible. It frees you from being pulled into structures that do not belong to you. And when you are no longer a character in someone else's story, you begin to write another story, not to tell, but to live. That story needs no antagonist. It needs no drama. It is built from steady breath, clear boundaries, and self-respect. This is the point where many empaths first encounter a strange form of freedom. Freedom from the need to be correctly understood. Freedom from the label of the good one. Freedom from proving worth through sacrifice. And within that freedom, a new ego forms quiet, undefended, yet stable. Leaving the villain role is not about leaving darkness. It is about no longer allowing someone else's darkness to define you. When this happens, the old story ends not through words, but through your absence. And that absence, not any explanation, is the true full stop. After the empath leaves the villain role and restructures the ego, a very subtle yet decisive change begins to unfold. It does not occur at the level of thought, nor through new beliefs. It happens within the relational energy field. You no longer enter the world at the same frequency. As a result, people you once attracted, or who once attracted you, begin to fade away naturally, without confrontation, without declarations. Previously, the empath was often defined in relationships by a familiar role. The listener, the one who endures, the one who understands, the one who stays when others destabilize. This role was not consciously chosen, but shaped by a psychological structure that believed worth lay in the ability to rescue. When healing occurs, the first thing to disappear is not love, it is the savior role. And when that role disappears, the entire relational ecosystem begins to reorganize. An awakened empath no longer attracts people who need to be saved. Not because you become cold, but because you no longer emit the signal of being willing to carry. Those seeking a place to unload emotions, someone to regulate their instability, or a figure to lean on without accountability, no longer feel aligned with you. There is no conflict, only a clear sense that there is nothing left to attach to. In the past, empaths were drawn to drama not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they were conditioned to confuse emotional intensity with connection. Where there was pain, you felt useful. Where there was chaos, you felt necessary. After awakening, however, your nervous system no longer seeks intensity, it seeks stability. And as the nervous system changes, attraction changes with it. This often surprises empaths. New relationships initially feel less dramatic, fewer highs and lows, less emotional intensity, no late night crisis conversations, no sense of only I understand them. To the old ego, this may feel dull. To an integrated ego, it is the mark of a healthy structure. New connections form on a different foundation. Clear boundaries, mutual respect, and reality. You do not need to prove your worth through sacrifice. You do not need to endure in order to stay. You do not need to carry emotions to preserve the bond. Your presence is welcomed for who you are, not for the function you serve. Another major shift is this. The empath no longer feels responsible for holding relationships together at all costs. When incompatibility appears, you do not panic. You do not try to fix the other person. You do not turn inward to search for your own fault. You recognize, adjust, or leave not in anger, but in clarity. And that clarity is precisely what was missing in earlier relationships. Those who enter your life at this stage often share one trait. They do not need you in order to exist. They are not seeking rescue, nor a mirror for self-definition. They have their own inner lives, take responsibility for their emotions, and can remain present through differences without turning them into drama. For the awakened empath, this is both unfamiliar and profound. Being in relationship without constantly having to do something. Notably, you do not need to try to attract these new forms of connection. They appear as a consequence. When you no longer carry rescue energy, you are no longer a magnet for dependent structures. And when you stop responding to drama, drama has no reason to stay. Many empaths fear that abandoning the savior role will lead to loneliness. Reality is often the opposite. Loneliness arises when you remain in relationships that require self-erasure. When you leave those structures, there may be a brief gap, but it is not emptiness. It is space. And that space allows healthier connections to enter. Most importantly, the empath begins to form a new relationship with themselves. You no longer evaluate yourself by how much others need you. You no longer feel guilty for not being available. You no longer fear abandonment simply because you set boundaries. This is the clearest sign that the savior role has ended not through a decision, but through inner maturation. And when the savior role ends, something very natural happens. You no longer need opposition to define yourself. You do not need a narcissist to know you are an empath. You do not need drama to feel alive. You enter a phase where relationships are no longer places to heal old wounds, but spaces to share an already stable life. This is the bridge into the final stage of the journey, when the narcissist is no longer the center of analysis, no longer the object to be understood, and no longer holds any power in your inner life. Not because you defeated them, but because you have left the reference system in which they once existed. At the end of this journey, the most important thing is no longer what the narcissist has done with your story, how they smeared it, how they rewrote it, or how long they continue to keep you in the role of the villain. Those questions once mattered because you lived within a system where truth was constantly distorted. But once the ego has been restructured, they no longer occupy the center. Not because they have been perfectly resolved, but because they are no longer necessary to your inner life. Becoming the villain in a narcissist story is not a moral failure. It is the natural consequence of no longer serving as the regulator for a structure that cannot stand on its own. You are not made into the bad one because you are cruel. You are made into the bad one because you are no longer willing to sacrifice yourself so that someone else does not have to face themselves. When this truth is faced directly, a layer of unconscious guilt begins to fall away. Many empaths take a long time to accept this. There are stories that cannot be repaired, not because you lack explanations, but because the other person cannot tolerate truth without collapsing. In such cases, silence is not avoidance. It is the highest form of honesty. Honesty with your boundaries. honesty with how much you are willing to give, honesty with the truth that you no longer belong to the old role. Through the lens of Carl Jung, this is the moment when individuation completes a crucial cycle. You no longer identify with the unconscious role that once kept you trapped in repetition. You do not need to be seen as good in order to know you are not cruel. You do not need vindication to know you were not wrong. When the ego no longer depends on external reflection, the power of the old narrative dissolves naturally. What is most profound is this: you do not leave in anger, nor do you leave to prove anything. You leave because staying is no longer aligned with the life within you. And it is precisely this undramatic departure that becomes the true ending, not of the relationship, but of the role that once drained you. When the narcissist is no longer the center of analysis, you do not become indifferent. You become present, present in your own life, in relationships that do not require rescue, in choices that do not require justification, in a rhythm of living no longer governed by other people's emotions. This is not a loud victory. It is quiet stability, the very thing you never had before. Finally, this must be stated clearly. You did not become the villain. You did not become cold. You simply stopped betraying yourself in order to sustain someone else's illusion. And when you do that, the old story, whether they continue to tell it or not, no longer has the power to define you, because you are no longer living inside that story. You are living your own life,